Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back once again. And today we're talking and continuing to talk about the letters that come from the tongue, from the makhraj of al-lisan. And today we're talking about 3 letters. In this video we'll talk about the makhraj of al-lam, al-noon and al-ra. So bismillah, let's start. In terms of what we want to get out of this video from a learning's outcome perspective, we want to get 3 main points. The first is to understand the makhraj of lam, noon and ra. The second is to understand the concept of ghunnah. And the third is to do with the ra and how do we avoid the excessive repetition of ra. So let's start with the makhraj of lam. In the last video, when we spoke about the makhraj of dad, we showed an image of the tongue and we talked about the edge of the tongue. And we talked about the furthest point of the tongue, the furthest point of the edge of the tongue, which is furthest from the lips, and then the nearest part of the edge of the tongue, and the end of the edge, or the tip. So when it comes to the lam, if this is your tongue looking from the top, when it comes to the lam, we're talking about the nearest part of the edge to the end of the edge, or the tip of the tongue. So that area there, from the nearest part of the edge to the tip. That's the area that we talk about when we talk about the lam. And to pronounce the lam correctly, or the makhraj of the lam, is from the nearest part of the edge, from both sides, to the very end or tip of the edge, with what lies opposite to it from the upper palate. So here is the picture of the tongue that we showed in the previous videos. This is looking at the tongue from the top, and then highlighted here in yellow, that area in yellow is the area that has to do with the makhraj of lam. So it starts from the nearest point of the edge, the nearest point of the edge with regards to the lips, all the way to the very end of the edge or the tip of the edge. So the nearest part of the edge, from both sides of the tongue to the end of the edge. That yellow part there, that's part of the makhraj of lam, and that touches what's opposite to it from the upper palate. And that's how the lam comes out correctly. And here's another picture for the makhraj of lam, and you can try it as you're looking at the picture and to see how those edges are touching the top of the palate, or the nearest part of the edge to the very end of the edge is touching the upper palate. Say al, 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 and feel where it touches. Al, al. So let's move on now to the makhraj of noon. And with the noon, it's from the tip of the tongue to what lies opposite to it from the gums. So the tip of the tongue with what lies opposite to it from the gums. It's actually really close to the makhraj of lam. And even the ra as well, that's very close to the makhraj of lam. So noon, tip of the tongue with what lies opposite to it from the gums. However, and there's something else that helps the makhraj or completes the makhraj. You have a nasal sound, so the sound comes out from the nose. And so if you close your nose, if you said and, if you close your nose, you can't pronounce the noon correctly. And now I'm going to sneeze. So if you close your nose, you can't actually pronounce the noon correctly. So the makhraj of the noon is the tip of the tongue with what lies opposite to it from the gums, with a nasal sound coming from the nasal area. Let's look at some pictures to clarify it a bit further. And here's the makhraj of noon. It's from the tongue perspective, it's close to where the lam was. You can see there, you can try to pronounce it, and you have the tip of the tongue is touching the gums, and when you say and, there's a nasal sound, so there's a sound that comes from the nasal area with the noon, and the noon cannot be correctly pronounced without nasal sound. Now, although it's easy to say that the noon has a nasal sound because it comes naturally, but the key here is to understand that not all letters have a nasal sound. So you don't want to have the nasal sound with other letters. So we'll define which letters have the nasal sound, noon and meme, and we'll have another video on the meme, Insha'Allah. But these are the only letters that have a nasal sound from the normal letters. Now the third letter we want to talk about is the ra. The ra is similar to the lam and the noon in terms of where the makhraj is. It's still from that tip of the tongue with what lies opposite to it from the gums. Say al, or ra, ra. So it's from the tip of the tongue with what lies opposite to it from the gums. However, when we say ra, there's a couple of things we have to keep in mind. Now firstly, let's compare the Arabic ra with the English r. The Arabic ra, you touch the gums. Again, the tip of the tongue with the gums. The English r, if you pronounce r, your tongue is in a completely different position. It's actually further back. It's not where the gums are. And with the English r, you don't actually touch the gums at all. Maybe a Scottish r, or maybe, but the UK or Australian r, we don't touch the gums. So the Arabic ra, the tip of the tongue touches the gums. And an important point with the makhraj of ra is, although the ra touches the gums, however, we don't have excessive repetition. So we don't say ar, ar. Now the correct pronunciation of ra is ar, ar, ar. So you're touching it, but you're not having excessive ar, that kind of vibration of the tongue. So what happens there is, if you've got the teeth there and the tip of the tongue is just touching behind it where the gums are, when you say ar, what's happening is that tip is kind of vibrating and bouncing. And that's because you're pushing too hard on the makhraj of ra and there's no gap. Now with the correct pronunciation of ra, that tongue there, there's a little bit of a void where it allows the sound to go through so that it doesn't vibrate continuously or doesn't have excessive vibration. So it does touch, but there's a little void, so the tongue would be doing like a little bit like that with a void in the middle, which allows the sound to go through without kind of pushing the tongue and doing the excessive vibration. And the only way to get the correct ra is to do it with a sheikh or a teacher to make sure that you get the correct pronunciation. So we don't want to say ar, we want to say ar, ar, ar-Rahman, ar-Rahim, not ar-Rahman, for example. So let's go to some images to help understand that concept. So here's the makhraj of the ra. As we said, the tip of the tongue is touching the upper gums. The very tip of the tongue is touching the upper gums, and it's very close to the makhraj of lam and noon. So the ra, we said, although it touches, however, there's a little bit of a void there which allows the sound to go through, which, what does that do? That stops the excessive repetition of the ra, so we can say ar and not ar, for example. Here's a picture of them, the noon and the ra right next to each other, to get a feeling for how close they are. Very, very close. But again, you can see one of the main differences is the noon has a nasal part, or a ghunnah, which completes that makhraj. So without the ghunnah, the makhraj isn't complete. The ghunnah completes the makhraj of the noon. So let's summarize again and make sure we've got the learning outcomes covered. First, we wanted to talk about the makhraj of the lam, the noon, and the ra. We said that the makhraj of lam is from the nearest edge of the tongue to the end of the edge. So the nearest edge from both sides to the end of the edge, with what lies opposite to it from the upper palate. And we said the makhraj of noon is from the tip of the tongue with what lies opposite to it from the gums. And with the makhraj of noon, we said there is a ghunnah which completes the makhraj of noon. And the ra, the makhraj of ra, is from the tip of the tongue with what lies opposite to it from the gums. And the third point we wanted to cover is the makhraj of ra and how to avoid excessive repetition of ra. And we said with the makhraj of ra, there's a little bit of a void which allows the sound to go through and stops that tongue from doing rrrr. And that's how we get the ra correct. But again, all this cannot be done without a sheikh to make sure that we pronounce the ra correctly, or a teacher. This is theory only to help out with the correct pronunciation. So that summarizes the makhraj of the lam, the noon, and the ra. And Insha'Allah, in the next video, we'll continue with the letters that come from the tongue, and we'll finish with that. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.